So in our last talk, we talked about levels of analysis, and I want to talk about a specific type of a level of analysis here in this talk about group development. So groups change over time, both structurally, what they look like, what happens in them, and dynamically. What are the interactions between members, between the members and the leader? So since the earliest psychotherapy groups, leaders kind of have noted these evolving dynamics, right? As we covered, Pratt talked about how patients became kind of more vulnerable and forthcoming over time. Beyond with his basic assumptions, kind of talked about their expectations for the leader, their relationship with their leader going from dependence to counter-dependence changed over time. Now the question is, how much do psychotherapy groups follow kind of an invariant sequence, and how much are they unique? Now, are there general consistencies regarding of how groups change over time, or is it really hodgepodge, totally random? I think there's a general agreement that groups seem to follow certain developmental progressions. Then there's disagreements about what those progressions may look like. So let's kind of give kind of some different views of looking at this. So Gibbard, Hartman, and Mann kind of used a three view taxonomy about how to kind of look at group models, which I think is still very, very relevant today, although there's been a few newer models that have come into play. So the first one is this progressive linear model. These models view groups as normally evolving through prescribed invariant stages or phases of development, kind of each marked by specific, say, cognitive, affective, relational kind of themes. I think the most well-known of this is discovered by Tuckman, the four-stage model of kind of forming, kind of everyone introducing themselves, storming, kind of intergroup conflict, kind of emotional expression between members and often towards the leaders, coming to some consensus, working towards consensus about what this group will be, how people will behave, what will get accomplished, what won't get accomplished. Kind of norming. Here you kind of see a development of a truer cohesion beyond just the forming stage, and kind of a increased compliance and engagement around the rules that were agreed upon in some way, and then in a discussion of these as they move along, and then the group kind of moves into performing or a working stage. So this has stayed a very popular model. I often tease that if you want to create a good model that becomes popular in psychology, you either have it rhyme or you have it start with the same letter. Have some kind of poetics in there. But Tuckman's idea of forming, storming, norming, performing are very easy to understand, explain to group members, and continues to be very serviceable in some studies around other cultures and multiculturalism in group. It's been shown to have some functionality and repeatability. And if you're going to know one model, I guess this would be the model to know. It would most likely be on your licensure exam, I would guess. Tuckman added a later stage with Jensen, which he called adjoining. And it's kind of the process of disengagement. You kind of review it's termination. What has been achieved, what hasn't been achieved, what can people take away from this experience in some way. So I think there's kind of been other kind of these progressive linear models that are worthwhile. I would talk about from a system-centered view Agazarian and Gantt, kind of building on the work of Bennis and Shepard, developed this 6-stage model, which has some overlaps to Tuckman's model, as it was kind of derived from an earlier model than Tuckman, and then kind of recreated after Tuckman's model became so popular. You also see some of Bion in this model, I think. So the first phase of this 6-phase model is dependence or flight. This is kind of focusing on the avoidance of the anxieties of attending to being a group member. There's a implicit dependence upon the leader to keep the group safe, to give order, structure, and kind of a opposite pull then forming kind of a flight avoidance, kind of a distancing, as one might quickly enter a group, or the group as a whole. So this is very much kind of a focus on the leaders, and very much a dependence that the leader must help new members feel safe, or in a completely new forming group, must help a new forming group kind of develop and find its way. So after this initial model of dependence, there's counterdependence, or counterdependence fight mode. Here the members might begin to show disagreements. They might act more rebellious, particularly towards the leader in some way. Now this is followed by kind of a power and authority exploration kind of stage and group. This is kind of even more kind of examining who's in control, who has the authority of the group, is the leader in control. It's a power struggle between members and often between the group and the leader. And then to some degree it reminds me, the resolution of this is in some way giving responsibility really back over to the members for their growth, their behavior, not becoming kind of a police person of the group, but kind of the shared collaborative process that we work through who will do what. In some way it reminds me of Whitaker, the family's therapist, kind of battle for motivation of change in some way. So after this stage comes this over-personal enactment, or enchantment, I mean. People feel great, people feel cohesive, people feel close. It's the bliss of group, not really a working phase of group, but kind of a euphoric oceanic bliss of being part of something, having gotten through these early difficult phases of forming into a group in some way. Now this, since it's not truly authentic, kind of is followed by the next phase, which is called kind of counterpersonal disenchantment. This is kind of a shared kind of loss of faith in the group, a loss of hope, a shared kind of demoralization that how close we felt at every phase doesn't last. I remember being in many training groups where we felt this really great after maybe one day of being together, and then after the second day, if the group ended, very disenchanted that we thought we were so close, but we're not nearly as close as we had hoped we were, and that we saw more and more differences between us. It's kind of like new love almost, that you eventually move from infatuation to a real relationship with one another. So I think once you get over this kind of, all these are forming stages, I think, you get into what Agazarian and Gantt call that interdependence work stage of group. This is the performing stage in Tuckman's model to some degree. It's a mature group kind of finding ways to work together, to understand each other better, to use each other's skills to kind of accomplish the goals of the group. This could be viewed as kind of a goal of intrapsychic change or learning new behaviors or new material. It could be applied to a work group in some way. That there's these various kind of stages that it goes to before a team, a work group can really work together. Arguments over authority, wanting to fight with each other for power, wanting to run away from the group, wanting the leader to be different than the leader is. But as these kind of stages get resolved, the group settles in to getting some work done. So that's a couple of kind of these progressive linear models of group. Now the next kind of models of group that you'll see is these life cycle models, kind of analogous to human life from birth to death in some way. Life cycle models kind of go through various stages of the human life. So you might see stages such as infancy. So in this stage you might see, is the world safe? Is the group safe? Kind of drawing on, say, Erik Erikson's work with childhood development. Then you'll see some toddler exploration. As people get to know one another in group, experiment with different kind of interactions with each other. And then after this excitement of exploration, if this goes well without big disruptions in safety, or if there were disruptions in safety, being able to manage some kind of group agreements, there's kind of a latency stage as it ease and quiet. There might still be underlying issues, but it doesn't feel like it needs to be explored. In my many years of doing Naropa groups, I would say groups 4, maybe 6 to 10 hours into a group, you'll see this kind of comfortable kind of latency. Let's not push things. Let's have good enough be good enough for now. So while people can feel connected in some kind of quasi-cohesion here, I think for groups really to move forward, going back to Addie Beck's work, you really need confrontation, conflict, rebel rouser, or what you might think of this life cycle model as teenage rebellion. There'll be dissatisfaction with the leader, potentially dissatisfaction with other group members, and this kind of quasi-cohesion will kind of be pushed either for deeper true cohesion, of which would include kind of each person being their unique kind of identity, challenging the group norms and rules, and getting deeper, more complex group rules that people can kind of function with, which would go into the kind of this more mature functioning level adulthood. People have a certain comfort with the process, with each other, have learned each other's strengths, challenges, support each other in bringing these forward, working productively towards growth of each other's members. There'll be, not to jump ahead, but people will go back and kind of be rebellious or do toddler exploration of new things. But overall, the general phase here is that the group is working together to get the task done of the group, whether that's learning how to work with one's anxiety or just a bigger self-exploration. And then there's kind of the end of life phase of group, kind of life review of the group, coming to terms with the ending, what happened, what hasn't happened, how to make sense of it, what do we take away from this experience in some way. So some of the other kind of models here that I would think of in life cycle models, a popular one comes from the classic book Psychodynamic Group Psychotherapy, initially done by Scott Rutan and Walter Stone, and then recently adding in the work of Joseph Shea, with this kind of 4-stage model. There's a formation stage with the issues of kind of trust and safety, getting to know each other. There's a reactive stage. There might be people wanting to be unique, wanting to show other sides of themselves, wanting to challenge the kind of norms that are getting set up here. Conflict, how will conflict be worked in the group? Then they get into this kind of working stage, mature functioning stage, where people are working with each other towards accomplishing the tasks of the group. And then finally the termination stage, what has been done, what hasn't been done, what are people taking away from the group. I think it's similar to an earlier model that McKenzie talks about, which is kind of 4 stages also. First is the engagement stage, getting to know each other, forming group cohesion, focusing on universality of whether symptoms of goals or challenges or here and now feelings. Kind of the differentiation phase where people wanting to be unique, thinking back again to Earl Hopper's stage of incohesion, massification. You were a mashed potato, now you want to be your individual potato in some way. And then kind of into what he called the interpersonal work stage, the mature work stage, the working stage of the group. People trying to accomplish things, kind of the forming and rebellious stage that working towards group agreements have been resolved to a large degree, and people are working together towards their goals of group. And then followed by finally by the termination phase of group. I guess I want to add another model here that's been used for a kind of a more recent model by Virginia Brabender and April Fallon. I think they've done a very, very thorough job of kind of exploring all the models, all the research in group psychotherapy development. And they came up with this 5-stage model. So first is this kind of formation, and you'll see similarities as they drew from the theory and research of the other models. Formation and engagement. People are getting to know one another, beginning to self-disclose with one another. This can go on for 30 minutes to 3 hours. And then afterwards is inevitably a conflict over authority and some rebelliousness. People want to be unique. People want to have a say in the agreements of the group. People want to make sure their needs are getting met. There's conflict about what the group will look like. This eventually gets talked through and resolved. This kind of sense of, now I understand you better, now I feel part of something, we've been through something. This 3rd stage they talk as unity and intimacy. It's kind of the groundwork of cohesion that kind of sets up the next stage, which would be integration and work. So people are exploring what they're doing with one another, exploring their relationships, their internal dilemmas, maybe getting advice, seeking guidance, giving feedback, accepting feedback. Maybe people will, in a very sophisticated group, kind of take on various roles of playing devil's advocate, or maybe monitoring the rules of the group, or helping everyone talk. So, and then the final stage, as you've seen in the other models, is kind of this termination review of the group. Each member does it. The group leader may do it. What has been done, what's left to be done. Now I want to bring in this other model that I really like, Although my doctorate was in clinical psychology, my specialization was in organizational psychology. So I took quite a few classes and had to do practicum and internship experiences in organizational psychology, and continues to be a area of fascination with me, and fascinated with how work groups such as team meetings at a mental health workplace or a political party or building a Habitat for Humanity house, how do these groups work together? Are there stages of development? So Whelan tried to kind of look across organizational and group psychotherapy, having a foot in both worlds, and came up with her 5-stage model. So the first stage here is kind of dependency and inclusion. So again, there's a looking for a leader, to a leader, for direction, for safety, for everyone to get included. Second phase, as we've seen, is this kind of counter-dependency and fight. Members disagree about group goals, what will happen, procedures, tasks, roles. So as this gets resolved, there's kind of trust and kind of a structure that takes place. There's more openness, there's more cooperation. People are working to get the task of the group accomplished in some way. Often this phase is kind of, the agreements are kind of finalized, although they can be renegotiated. And then there's kind of work and productivity. Why are we here? What are we doing? Let's get to it. The group I can think of the groups I've led now that have been going on for months or years. Members come in, they sit down, and people will say, I have something I want to talk about. Someone else will say, I want to talk about something that happened last week. Someone else will say, I have an update to give and I want your feedback about this. And the group members are really working together, maximizing their time, maximizing what they have to offer each other. Whelan calls this the work productivity stage. And then there's the termination stage, what it's like to say goodbye. Typically in termination stages and say depth-oriented psychotherapy or psychodynamic-oriented groups, you might do this and review how goodbyes have been done in the past, what might be a new way, a better way, potentially a curative emotional process of a way of saying goodbye. So this is some of the models that are, I would say, are kind of these life stage kind of models of people moving forward in some way. So there's some commonalities between these progressive linear models and these life cycle models, as I'm sure you can already picking up on, right? So I think all of these models kind of propose an initial formative stage that reflects the anxieties of joining a group, right? Concerns about losing one's individuality for the sake of cohesion, kind of committing of oneself to the tasks and values kind of embodied by the group. Then an initial kind of hope and dependency upon the leader to make this a safe place to provide direction. Also, I would say, for these type of groups, there's a clear ending point. There's a termination stage. So this is kind of models that were drawn from often time-limited, 12-week skill-building, symptom reduction types of groups. Now, within both these models, there are kind of a confrontation stage that is working with the leader's authority, building collaboration with the leader, and that this kind of storming phase needs to get resolved before kind of a deeper, more mature work stage can get accomplished. So different languaging, as we've seen throughout this course, about how people view these different stages, different emphasis on different stages, kind of a pull between a reductionistic model and more complexity models. But generally, this kind of life cycle, kind of linear developmental stages has these kind of three models of kind of forming, and then kind of confrontation, and then at some point termination. Let's stop there, and I'll come back and I'll talk a little bit more about some other theories and models of group development.